Okay, so let's get going. So what would, if you were going to ask a question, which would be equivalent to what we might call the general equivalent of discourse. That is, where you would, hopefully your answer would yield that which covered any possible questions or thoughts you might have.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, no, I can never repeat a question. If you're going to ask what would be called a general equivalence discourse, okay? Where you would ask a question that somehow can establish all of the questions, to give you an answer that you can perceive. What is the ultimate question you could ask? What would it?
That helps.
So what would you ask? What? Talking about the general equivalent here. You know, the gold standard of language.
Would that have been, what is the meaning of life?
Could be, yeah, that sounds, yeah. Is it? All right, how many of you would ask that question? Anybody ask that question? Or don't you care about me? You already figured it out, right? That's a baby boomer thing.
It's even like, what is your meaning?
Well, all right.
But it's like, that's a little bit.
What is your meaning?
I'm wondering if that's even more.
I'd like to know about my meaning a little bit. And I'd like to figure out your meaning. But what is meaning?
Okay. Okay.
Good, I like that. There was a famous philosopher for many years at Harvard, and I actually took a class from back in 2015 with Stanley Cavell. And there was a story about him. We were in a class, you know how students do it. He's talking about meaning, that's kind of his shtick. When the student says, Professor Cavell, you know, what do you mean by that? And Cavell, who had classes, various classes, and the young man asked him a question. He takes up his class and says, young man, what do you mean? What do you mean? In other words, it's actually Wittgenstein's question. Famous 20th century philosopher who started the philosopher of language. What is the meaning of reading? All right, so yeah, that's a general equivalent question. Anybody got another question that sounds a little like that, feels a little like that? I've forgotten. I've gone over an hour and a half. I've been in Seattle school. I haven't said, does it feel like anything? What is the meaning of meaning, and what is meaning? What else might you want to ask?
Why do we care?
That's good. When you ask why, you're asking for general principles that can serve as general equivalents for further concepts. Anything else? Yes.
Maybe just why this principle exists as opposed to not exist, or why in this particular way.
Yeah. Okay, well, one thing I noticed here, you're all kind of obsessed with why questions. Yeah. How about what questions? What's it all about? Or what is the nature of ultimate reality? Why? What? Whither? Where is it going? An alternative. Interesting, all words in English at least that begin with WH, which come from the Anglo-Saxon the old humanity and so forth. But, why? In the sense we're breathing into the cosmos when we ask these questions. And, we don't ask these questions without expecting some response. Some answer that. Okay. Now, I talked a little bit about the social historical, kind of venue for beginning to seek a general equivalent for discourse, which went along with the general equivalent for exchange in an incipient era of global, what we now call globalizations. But the Greeks had a word for this, for the why and the what. Or let's say what they were basically seeking was language of the story. And the Greek word, I'll try to turn them off, is iteo, from which we get the word etymology. But tell me what an etymology is.
How do you know?
No.
Etymology is origin words, yeah.
Origin words, yeah. Or the search for origins. In other words, how far back can we go in a system of explanations? So we get to say, okay, this is where we have to end, because this somehow explains it all. The term is often translated as cause. But the English causa is really kind of different in both its impact and its subtle meanings in the Greek word ikeo. In the Greek New Testament, which some good number of you are familiar, it takes on an even more refined meaning in Jesus' time. It's basically about fault. It's like, okay, on what can we blame something? So when Jesus talks about, whether a man has any cause for divorce, that's the word iteon. Plural is itea. Now this is a long way from the way it was meant in Plato and Aristotle's time, and actually before Plato. But in some ways, the whole question of fault or fault finding belongs to the honored tradition of philosophy called theodicy, which is trying to explain why stuff happens. So, in other words, one is somehow trying to account in some kind of ultimate way for disruption, dysfunction, or as we talked about the last hour, trauma. So the search for causes is not necessarily disinterested, right? For a long time, nobody understood that diseases were caused by germs. About a germ theory, related to virus theory of pathology, belongs to the 19th century. And even when we know that there are causes, we don't necessarily know what the specific causes are. Okay? We know that there is a genetic relationship between hereditary diseases or certain kind of diseases like cancer, but we don't know what specific gene necessarily cause it, in some cases whether genes even involved or not. So, germ theory, gene theory, even the theory of personal responsibility for crimes and injustices goes back to this particular idea. Let's out of the scientific and put more at the political. We know about lex talionis, which is really the operative norms for so much of the ancient world, 9 for 9 and 2 for 2, as it was put in formulation. Well, we know before that there was a whole notion of the blood feud. There was the idea of collective revenge. You know, you kill a member of my clan, I wipe out your clan, and you say, how barbaric. But in many ways, if you look to how even in ancient Greece, the whole idea of fate, or moira, M-O-I-R-A, it's the Greek word for fate, was based on this whole idea of a portion and a lot. And it was revolved around the whole concept of balance. You know, if there's a crime committed, you have to somehow make sure that the universe is set right. You know, if a great soul or a great warrior is killed, and the value of that warrior in terms of the general equivalent, which we call justice, decay, the Greek, that has to be compensated accordingly, and so forth. That very often can involve a blood feud. Now, the idea that, well, maybe it's not a question of the distribution of forces in the universe that matters so much, but who did it and why they did it, and whether they had good reason for doing it, and the nature of the punishment should be allotted according to the not only the severity of the crime, but also their motivation, all that which we take for granted is almost a no-brainer in terms of modern theories of jurisprudence. That all goes back to a certain kind of refinement of the principle of causality, personal causality and responsibility. So, in fact, you can even read so much of Jesus' revision of the ethics of rabbinic Judaism, usually introduced with the phrase, "But you have heard it said, but I say to you." That's, in a sense, an effort to try to somehow make sense of the Aition in a way that really accounts for every variation we experience in the universe. Okay, so the philosophers of starting with about the 6th century BC, philosophers who were generally called pre-Socratics because they came before Socrates. Plato was the Socrates didn't write anything, but you know, Plato wrote down what he said or what he wanted to have said, one we remember, and so forth. So the pre-Socratics were also the Greek Platonists and so forth. But you know, they heavily influenced Plato. And basically they were asking the question of the ultimate why or what, the ITM. And they wanted to, in a sense, understand the general equivalent of all knowledge, the one principle by which all things, all phenomena as they appear, all matters of sense, can somehow be reconciled. So, you know, I look up at the sky and I say it's a bird. The person says, no, it's a plane. You say, no, it's Superman! But, okay, why isn't it a bird? Or why isn't it just a plane? Why does it have to be Superman? You see that kind of sequence? Look up in the sky. What do you see? You know, what your senses say? We know the senses see this. Not all the time. Hence the proverb, seeing and believing. But after all, the disciples saw the risen Jesus, and we're still arguing today whether they really saw other things. So, what it even means to say, you know, we saw Jesus risen. So, this becomes not really a question of the senses, it becomes a question of what we say. It becomes a matter of what the Greeks call logos, which is the etymological root of words like language, logic, even law. And possibly other forms of derivatives. So what is logos? Well, the first Greek philosopher was a guy named Theodoros. And in order to address the question of the idea, he said, well, let's see if I can figure out, he said, what is the nature of reality? That's the question one of you asked. Probably because, spend so much time in Seattle here, you know what reality is, so you don't have to ask the question, right? It means a lot of coffee and a lot of rain, and legalized pot. In Colorado, we have legalized pot too, but we don't have a lot of rain. So I guess you don't have much rain this year. Let's drive all that. In Texas, we have a lot of rain. Lots of rain. So how do we approach the question of sensation and the variability of what we see or what we think we're seeing? Because we don't really know what we're seeing until we can say what we're seeing. We have to raise the question of logos. And interestingly, after Theology said, well, obviously it's water, right? Water's everywhere. It just came from Dallas like I did yesterday. You would probably agree with that. There's been this gigantic puddle outside the window of our place down there for the last 3 months. Just a gigantic puddle. It's not supposed to be a lakefront property, but they factor it in. And when we try to go to an art event, I want to zipping in. Yeah, it's like it was like running a maze because you go to this underpass and you get in the water. You go to, it wasn't even raining. This was like left over from 3 or 4 days before. So yeah, if you can, especially if you live on the ocean, as Bailey did, you lived in along the coast of what is now Turkey, and this was known as the Ionian coast. Lived in a city, ancient city called Miletus, M-I-L-E-T-U-S. These are called Milesian philosophers. Because they were traders, they were naturally trying to ask the general question, what we would call the scientific question of what it is. And for him, she said, yeah, if you look out there, it's water. Okay? But along comes another philosopher and says, well, it's air. And then another philosopher, by the name of Anaximander, says, well, it's the apeiron, the unlimited, the indefinite. I always thought that was really cool when I was in my 30s and just starting out teaching at the university. And I thought it was great, so I actually had this custom-made T-shirt that said apeiron. Wear it around, I would say, well, you want to promote philosophy, just go around in your T-shirt, that says apeiron, and people say, well, what's that mean? What's this about? Engagement conversation. Rather, I would get a response which was very discouraging. So, why are you wearing that T-shirt that says apeiron? I said, no, it's not pronounced apeiron. It's apeiron. It's about philosophy. Well, I don't get it. Why is it stupid? Anyway, so much for my philosophical evangelical project. Philosophy is not meant to. If you want to go out the street corner with my Jesus, that's fine. But, don't talk about the principles of the universe. But then you have this philosopher by the name of Heraclitus. who's probably one of the most significant long-term philosophers for the 20th and 21st century, because he is generally regarded as the philosopher of change, the first who was able to articulate the meaning of change. And, you know, everyone from Nietzsche to Deleuze, who, in a sense, tries to articulate philosophy as becoming, is always saying, well, let's go back to Heraclitus. So the real question in philosophy is not Athens or Jerusalem. It's Plato or Heraclitus. Because Plato is the one, as you will see in Phaedo, which is the philosophical text you were asked to read the first time, you know, asks, you know, what is it that endures? What is pure being? What is something which is unvariable, which is immutable, which is eternal, which cannot be, you know, created or destroyed, which just is in some kind of invariant way. But then we know that we experience everything we do, even because we live in this environment which is a temporal environment. We all experience time, motion, change, transformation, things going a different way. You know, yesterday I was 36, today I'm 106. You didn't know that. And, you know, I'm changing. I don't even use Botox, but I try. Botox is probably the closest thing we have in the postmodern way to. But, you know, in some ways we're always trying to prevent change, but yet we can also celebrate change. You know? And we also, you know, we all feel more comfortable today with motion. You know, somebody tells me, well, that's an immutable, absolute truth. It cannot be changed. And by the way, God said it too. Get your hand up. In, you know, our postmodern, you know, post-millennial environment, you know, we say, then it's fighting words. It's all about change. It's all about immutability. You know, we don't want into that kind of paternalistic crap. You know, spoken congregations. It's all about becoming who you are to be, but you can't ever really be because you're all in the process of becoming. So we love becoming. That's, you know, that's our time. Well, we can thank Heraclitus. We've kind of, at least for right now, chosen Heraclitus. But Heraclitus actually came up with this particular way of looking at, you might say, a philosophy of change, because he heard a voice from the goddess. He was a priest of the goddess. The goddess who spoke, the goddess who said, do not discern through your senses, but through logos. Not discern through your senses, but through logos. Logos, speaking, language. As the 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger puts it, language speaks. Language speaks from the unspoken. And because language and thought are inextricably intertwined, that thought and speech are inseparable at the same time. You always think from the matrix of the unthought, which is the ability to say it. What probably the greatest psychoanalyst of the 20th century, who has influenced so much of postmodern philosophy indirectly, you know, who considered himself from an era of Freud, but he really went beyond Freudism, and still cited today. In fact, there are even practitioners, not too many from America, but from Europe, they're all over the place. This psychoanalyst is named Jacques Lacan. I am actually a member of the Denver-based Lacanian cartel. In the Colorado Sacramento. I was invited to be a member. And we're having our online cartel tonight to talk about. But Lacan was the one who developed Freud's whole notion of the talking period, and in very ways it's very Heraclitean. Because in some ways for Lacan, you cannot be a subject. It's the whole purpose of analysis. Like their analysis. There's a reason for that. When the subject is something which is spoken in a being, usually at the tolling of the bell, the high hour of noon, where you are all in the process of speaking into being what you are, usually through your trauma, through your, your reticence, through your stuttering, for everything you don't want to say. And that everything you don't want to say is because somehow you know that if you say it, it's going to be inauthentic, or it might reveal what you really are, what you don't want to say, so you avoid it, so you repress it, and psychoanalysis terms, and on and on and on. And once you can begin to speak authentic, then in a sense you are, according to the language speaks. Logos is what makes being be, or is responsible in that sense for being be. And in this way, Heraclitus said, you have to hear the logos before you can say anything that is real. Doesn't mean that it makes it real, but it gets you there. It gets you there, and sometimes it's always on the edges of language, the borders of language, where you know the unspeakable that is beyond what is spoken is allowed, is in a sense reveals what is truly real. Okay, so why am I spending a lot of time on this? Because we are all practitioners of logos. And logos is not, as Heidegger put it, just simply chatter. It's not talking about the weather. It's not, simply an endless conversation of hey dude. Logos, when we speak to each other particularly, when we are in therapy, or when we're trying to develop a relationship, or trying to understand philosophy, or trying to talk back to the professor, what are we doing with logos? We're trying to get into the space of meaning that we've never entered before. We're trying to make sense out of things. We're penetrating the mysteries of language. And the way we're penetrating the mysteries of language is come up with some kind of stable order of meaning whereby we can say in the same way over and over that we can reiterate what we've said before using the structure of language so that it becomes meaningful, so it becomes real, so it becomes real. So when you say, what did you mean, or can you say that again? You have to do that. I can never repeat what I said, but I'll try to kind of recapitulate, try to go back over to get you to another point. In some ways, it's the flow of logos, which is always circulating. Life changes. When we want to get to that principle that somehow binds it all together, we call the general equivalent. And that becomes not the flow of logos, but logic. Being able to say X is Y. Yes.
So something that's been bothering me is when we talk about why and causality, it sounds very past to present tense. Is there, on like a timeline of logos, is there a future tense? Is that possible, or is it not possible because reality is linear?
Well, let me ask you a question. Why are you asking?
I think when I thought of the question why, it felt very...
But I just said why.
Why?
It's about present, right?
Yes.
Why are you asking me this now? Is that about past? No, it's about your motivation in the present. Okay? So you can say, well, I'm never taking philosophy, I don't understand, that's past. And I say, well, Susie, you may not get it now, my dear, but you will. Just bear with me. You will get it. Eventually. No. That's future, right? So language is something that always happens in time. And the more we speak, the more we get. What did you say? Can you explain that? Okay, I get that. And then you asked me a question. Well, what did you mean by that? I said, what's happening? Language, logos is stabilizing the flux of sensation and the various meanings and the improprieties of this. But we're trying to arrive at a general equivalent. We're trying to, come to this principle by which all this change is regulated and determined. You're saying, okay, well, it's all about the past. It's about the future. See? No?
I'm still struggling to see it in the future. I think from
Struggling to see what in the future.
when I think about philosophy in general, I feel like it's very present or past related and not as much future related. It's more of in this moment or what has already happened and is causing that.
Well, we're looking at past philosophers, that's true, right? If you there's something called the Bible, what's the Bible?
It's a text.
You read that text here, I think, sometimes. Why, that whole thing was written quite a while back, right? There hasn't been there's been a lot more philosophers who have come about since that particular book was written, right? So does that mean that that's just about the past?
No, but some of the questions that are asked are related to the future, and I think the questions we're asking right now, like when I hear why, for example, I can't think of what's the future version of why.
I can. Yeah. Why is the world? Have you heard of eschatology? Eschatology. The expectation of the end of the world. I mean, famous formula I learned, taking a course in Old Testament years ago, famous Old Testament. That eschatology is always based on protology. That's the theory of beginning. How many times you hear someone, well, what God is doing is you're part of the journey to restore God's order of creation. Take us back to the garden, but it won't really be the garden. It'll be the new heaven and new earth. Or, as the philosopher Heidegger puts it, origin comes to meet us. Friedrich Nietzsche, who I consider one of the greatest philosophers of the modern era, found genius, mad, in his life. He saw his task as being write a philosophy of the future, and he saw the philosophy of the future was one which would affirm being as becoming. Becoming, which is in a sense always leading to transformation, which he called overcoming. And he saw not as some kind of science fiction, superhero figure. The whole notion of word you probably heard before it misled, but he saw the philosophy of the future as being able to articulate the meaning of the old man. That is, a human being who is totally transformed. The mind that is totally transformed. The creativity in us, which is finally realized. It brings about this radical transformation. He said the only philosophy is a philosophy. And look at even a figure like Plato, who we're probably not going to get to. But Plato's most famous book, which is very often misread not because people read it wrongly, but they read it too narrowly. They think it is about one thing or the other. It's either about the theory of knowledge, or it's about the ideal sketch for an ideal polis, the ideal state, the political order of things. Or they see it as a kind of grab bag, sort of compendium of all Platonic philosophy, which that's what we really, of course, I'm talking about, which in Greek is politeia, which means really the theory of living together. That's what it really means. So, how do we live together? We can only live together if somehow we understand the nature of reality. Not only we understand the nature of reality, can we begin to understand how we might go about living together in the proper way, how we can order our relationships and so forth. And, he does a lot of thought experiments and throws stuff out, throws it against the wall. That's what the Republic is. And it's a brilliant book. It's beautiful. Born so long, we probably read it in this book. But why is Plato doing all that in this particular book? Because in many ways he's trying to see how the future of human beingness can be reshaped if somehow we get to the real idea, which is the source of knowledge, which we can somehow be able to say that which is the ultimate sense of the word. So this is this famous theory of the forms, which is actually meant for guiding not metaphysicians or speculative philosophers, but is meant for guiding political leaders. You might say it's leadership theory in some kind of ultimate sense of it. How, in a sense, can we live the good life? How do we live? That's what the Republic is all about. That's what philosophy is. Philosophy is about how then should we live. Not what for its shape necessarily, but these questions again. So the question of the cause is not just a past question, it's a future question. In the Republic, Plato lays out what we call the ideal state would look like, but of course then he thinks, well, I'm going to go to Syracuse and try to make this happen. The whole project falls apart. Consider the fed. What happens to utopians and ideals. Most people have a theory of an ideal state or of a ultimate utopian political order, failing. Karl Marx, who thought he was the most scientific of all thinkers because he was understanding where history was going before he can realize what history and adjustment would be. Even Marxism became historically a common measure. There's no ideal political order that Christianity has come up with either. People keep trying. Even the Inquisition is all about trying to somehow tease out what they consider to be the utopian kernel of Christianity. Yes, reverse the utopianism and totalitarianism usually sides at the same point. But ultimately we want somehow to live better. And that's why we do philosophy, because how can I, in a sense, say that it ought to be this way, we ought to have this kind of order of society if I don't know how to say what this order of the universe is. The whole environmental movement started as a response to polluted streams. Rachel Carson's famous book in 1961, Silent Spring. It's like, yuck. I'm living in this gross environment, I don't want to take it anymore. And pretty soon this evolved into why am I living in this gross environment? Well, because of my industrial society, which is a result of technology and ultimately for consumerism and products, and lo and behold, all of us are affected by the water I dump into the streams or the stuff that I put into the atmosphere, or my lifestyle choices, my carbon footprint, et cetera, and so forth. And all of a sudden, we have a whole notion of a kind of holistic, planetary, depending on how you structure either egalitarian or hierarchical, either way, view of human beingness and in a relationship what we call ultimately requires an effort to saving the planet. You know, and so that's in some ways even ecology or ecological consciousness is the discovery of a new kind of idea, an idea of the whole. In fact, that everything is somehow interrelated to everything else. And it's not accidental the word ecology and economy, which are the two kind of sciences that seem to have planetary impact and which we can't get away from today. You can't have a global ecology without a global economy, and vice versa. The two aren't necessarily in sync with each other. They both come from the Greek word oikos, from which we get the same word ecumenical, which means the house. A household, which is the global household. All human beings living in the household. And the question is, do all human beings live in this household according to doing whatever they want? Or living in the household according to finding a kind of right relationship where everybody, in some ways, is in harmony. So, that's what Greek philosophy is really all about. The search for the general equivalent is not some neutral, abstract scientific principle. Science itself is an effort to try to find the conceptual general equivalent which will aid us in the process of knowing how to live. Now, you say, okay, but I'm suspicious of science. Are you suspicious of science, or are you suspicious of scientific? Because after all, philosophy is really the effort to kind of lay out the rules of science. The word science comes from the Latin scientia, which is the Latin equivalent of Sophia, from which we get philosophy. So, science in its original sense can mean wisdom. And Sophia is in some ways this quest for the first principle of law. Obviously we wouldn't have environmental laws, we wouldn't have environmental consciousness, we wouldn't have an environmental ethic if we didn't have the science of ecology, which developed out of the search for basically the explanatory principles for why the environment was so yucky in the first place. Comes out of trauma, comes out of a sense of dysfunction. Dysfunction is seeking a new order, a new harmony, a higher understanding of how things can not be better in an abstract sense, but better in a relation. Now, okay, that's all I want to say by way of introduction. Anybody have any questions? That seem reasonable or not? Anybody tell me why we should be studying philosophy? Did I encourage anybody who was scared, or did I just scare a lot of people? Maybe some encouraged. Would anybody want to read a book of philosophy? Do it. Why? Why would you want to read a book of philosophy? You know, let's say you can have cliff notes too. You can really explain the book.
Oh, I would probably go with notes first. Yeah. Two of my favorite authors are like very philosophical, existential. So, like, after reading them quite a bit, I just started reading Hegel. So.
Oh.
Yeah.
You just read Hegel in your spare time. The nice thing is, all the great philosophers of the world, you can pretty much read for free if you have a Kindle. You can basically get all the collected works, including even the philosophers that we're talking about today. Or I discovered, too bad you probably bought the book from Cambridge, the one on Descartes, quite a bit, but I discovered you can get the same book, exact same translation on Kindle for 99 cents. I just discovered that. Who else besides Hegel? It tells me a lot about who you are. Favorite philosopher.
I just started reading. Other than 2 books on Hegel, I have 2 books on existential philosophy, and I can't think of any of the contributors.
And what is it about those books that kind of turns you on?
What is it about?
Yeah.
I find that it really brings kind of some texture and some kind of fills in the hollowness that's maybe present in the world and in education, and particularly counseling and psychology. It brings, a lot of meat to what you're doing.
That's interesting. What kind of ingredients are those? What's the nature of the meat? So you can answer the question, where's the beef in a real sense? What is it? What's the beef like?
I don't understand the question.
No, I mean, you said it really gives you some meat in your counseling psychology.
Yeah.
And I was asking, what's the meat? Is it pork, beef, chicken,
No.
venison, rabbits, and squirrel, kind of stuff we eat in Texas.
I would say that it's probably steak. Or
What makes it steak?
because it has affected every part of my life and the way that I view most things.
How so?
I think going into questions such as like, what is suffering? What is memory? What is the meaning of life? What does it mean to connect with another person? What does it mean to have a relationship with yourself? Well,
What is the nature of the subject itself? I just finished teaching a whole course at the University of Denver called Theory of the Subject. Very interesting course. We started off with Hegel, and we ended up, we read Taking Some Depth, despair and anxiety, and struggle with self, become a self, and all this kind of thing. This is, right, yeah, I mean, this is the one thing, I mean, even a figure like Lacan, who I just mentioned, as well as Freud, they couldn't, Freud liked myth, Lacan liked philosophy. It's always driving ideas from philosophy. In fact, the whole issue is, was Lacan really a psychoanalyst, or was he really a philosopher, or was he both? The other two really weave indivisible. So, yeah, I mean, it gives you a sense. It asks you questions you wouldn't ask before. All of us like our formulas. All of us like our routines. We all like a way of doing something in the same way until it fails. You keep doing it in the same way, and what is it we call doing something in the same way and getting the same result? It's that, right? Or neurosis, at least. And most of us, in our avoidance of philosophy, end up neurotics. We end up cognitive, neurotics. We may not, read the great philosophers, because the great philosophers will not give us answers to specific questions, but they will, in a sense, give us a way of talking and thinking and scrutinizing ourselves, and of framing the issues in life in a wholly different way that may be productive and somehow working through those specific issues. It may be ours, or with a client, or a friend. So, if you wanted, and we'll be talking this afternoon about the relationship between philo and theo. Wisdom has to do with the divine. Plato would have heard the same thing. That's why I think ultimately theology and philosophy are just simply two, kind of emphases you want to give to the same project. All right, well, let's take our lunch break. I'm getting hungry now. And we'll start back up at 2. Pretty much. Okay.
Excuse me.